They warned the doctor she was trouble, but he smiled softly and said, "Not to me." The line hung in Matthew Hayes's head like the epigraph to a case file as he pushed the swing door into room 412. The lights were low, the afternoon had thinned to a wash of hospital green and the lemon plain scent of disinfectant. A paperback, Charlotte Brontë, a battered copy, its spine cracked where someone had read and reread, sat splayed on the bedside table beside a dented thermos. The thermos was wrapped in an old cloth napkin. Someone had written "CHAMOMILE" on the lid in black Sharpie. Small things that made a room feel like a life. The chart lay open, the scanned entry scrolling on the tablet mounted to the bed rail. He had read thousands of lines like these. Vital signs, documentation of rounds, a list of medications that read like shorthand prescriptions of comfort and restraint. Near the top, a handwritten note caught him. The grapefruit pink of the paper was ordinary, the ink a hurried brown. The sentence was short, "Don't save me." It wasn't the first time an inked instruction upended the rhythm of a shift. But the line, folded into the chart like a confession slipped between pages, moved through him with the same quiet force as a wrong note in a familiar hymn. What did save mean? What did me mean? Whose voice had written it? All those questions insisted on being resolved before the day folded into evening. Evelyn Blackwell lay half-reclined, eyelids fluttering like shut curtains. Her skin had the thin, delicate translucence of age, freckled across the bridge of her nose, a scatter that would have proclaimed itself under summer light. A nurse had left a clean pitcher of water on the tray, a paper packet of plush tissues creased under the paperback. Her hands were folded across the blanket, as if at prayer. Under the sheet, a thin callus of medical tubing and gentle adhesive marked a life that had been carefully tended and repeatedly measured. Matthew leaned in. He had the habit of noticing the small calibrations, the patient's favorite book, the exact warmth of a hand squeeze when they could manage it, the thin smell of tea. He read the chart again, this time more slowly. Consults scheduled and then canceled. 2 different neurologists listed in the initial ER notes, one with a brief message, "See outpatient," and another with a formal consult request that never seemed to have been completed. Occupational therapy notes that appeared as single tentative entries and then stopped. The medication administration record, the MAR, showed an unusual pattern, a series of PRN entries, administered as needed, clustered at hours when family visits were recorded. He didn't leap to conclusions. He was a physician trained to check for confounders, to look for patterns and the simplest explanations before the sinister ones. But habits formed in emergency rooms and night shifts meant that his gaze was drawn to the gaps with the same instinct that made him recheck a pulse twice. "Dr. Hayes?" The voice at the doorway was small. Leela, one of the floor nurses, stood there with an uneasiness edged in her shoulders. Her scrubs were soft with long hours. She wouldn't look directly at the patient. "Leela." He could tell she had been holding something. Nurses carried many small burdens, medication errors, conversations with families, the things patients could not say. She crossed the room with the guarded steps of someone carrying evidence. In her palm, she held a phone in a case taped at the edge, as if to keep it together. "I thought it was wrong," she said. "I thought maybe I was seeing things, but then I saved it. I wanted to show you." Her voice was a claim and an apology at once. Matthew set his tablet down and gestured to the chair. He had seen nurses hand him notes before. He had never been handed an audio file with the gravity that made his throat go dry. He read her face, the flash in her eyes that meant she had listened, the small furrow between her brows that didn't belong simply to fatigue. She placed the phone on the bedside table. "It's from last Tuesday," she said. "Damon left it here. He recorded. He said he was trying to prove something to his mother. He doesn't know I kept it." Matthew's mouth made no noise. He felt the schoolteacher reflex: keep calm, gather facts. He did not let his hands tremble as he opened the audio. The file was small and brittle, the sound of a closed room. A chair scraped, a voice, smooth and practiced: Damon. Damon, Blackwell's voice, the son who managed the family's affairs, spoke in the clipped, reassuring cadences of someone used to making decisions. Just a few more nights, the recording said. Keep her quiet. We'll get the papers. We don't need her fighting this. Once the trustee signs, everything moves faster. She's safer that way. There was a second voice, muffled, a cough, a woman. The tape clicked as if to punctuate the plan. Later, Damon laughed softly. Don't wake her for the meds, he said. No reason to test anything. No reason to call the neurologist. We'll take care of it. Matthew felt as if someone had lifted the room's humidity and exposed the mechanics of control. He had to remind himself to breathe. The word safe in that voice slid strange across the recording. Safe for whom? For the bank account? For the family reputation? For someone who wanted quiet rather than care? He listened once, then again, noting the timestamps Leela had saved with the file. Whoever had recorded it had been precise. Her fingers closed into the cloth of her knitting, an old habit she used to keep herself present. The phone's battery icon showed he had been right to open it. The audio had been preserved. Did you record this? Matthew asked. Leela's face went tight. No, I didn't. I didn't mean to keep it, really. It was playing on the son's phone while he was in the room. I was charting. I heard him mention the trustee and Her words fell. I felt wrong. I took a screenshot of the file and saved it. I didn't want to. I didn't want to get in trouble. She had done exactly what the system hoped someone would do and also feared to reward. Nurses were in the cross-currents of care and family authority. They saw the patient in the moments when physicians didn't. They had power to observe and the vulnerability to be ignored. Leela's hands trembled now, not from confession, but from the knowing of consequences. Matthew turned the phone screen so he could see the metadata, the file name, a timestamp that matched a PRN administration logged in the MAR. He remembered the cluster of sedative entries, the hours when the room had quieted. He remembered the absent signatures and the canceled consults. He kept his voice low. Did you tell your supervisor? No. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw the fear that his intervention might set off consequences, both for her and for Evelyn. I didn't. I'm afraid they'll tell me to mind my place, but I saved it. Good, he said. Stay with that file. Keep it intact. Don't forward it. Let me. He flipped his tablet open and began to make clinical notes. He used the hospital's secure documentation portal, the one that logged each access with a user ID and timestamp. Procedure, procedure, procedure. The best protection for both the patient and the whistleblower. When a clinician chooses to escalate, the first act is always to document thoroughly. It is second nature, one foot in clinical certainty, the other in the legal scaffolding. Matthew's hands moved with that calm efficiency. He set the phone as physical evidence on the bedside table, then used the hospital's secure evidence repository to upload a copy. He labeled the file, recorded the hash, and printed a chain of custody log. He did not, in that moment, think of heroics. He thought of logs and signatures and the slow rhythm of safety checks. Leela watched him, shoulders hunched. If I'm wrong, you may be right, he said. He kept his mouth soft. He did not say the things you thought when you saw a life potentially being hollowed out by those entrusted to protect it. He said instead, you did the right thing bringing this to me. Outside the room, the corridor was full of polished shoes and the dull clack of the barcode printer. In the glass of the nursing station window, Matthew caught a reflection of his own face, chin shaved, eyes rimmed with the fatigue of an attending covering a long list of consults. He made the call to risk and compliance. The number went to a recorded line and then a person. Harriet answered. Risk manager, procedural, her voice practiced in calm. This is Dr. Hayes on 4 West. I need to file an incident. I have a recording and some chart discrepancies. Have you flagged it in the EMR? Harriet asked. A standard question meted out to test the basic line of documentation. I've made a note, Matthew said. I'm uploading an audio file to the secure repository. Chain of custody log will be printed in my office. Patient is Evelyn Blackwell, DOB. He rattled the identifying details, the way a person reciting a poem recites the first lines to anchor the rhythm. As he spoke, the emergency of the situation didn't settle into panic. It sharpened into procedural focus. Harriet promised to pull the file as soon as it uploaded. The hospital would, by policy, freeze any transfers and open a formal review. The risk network would consult legal. The machine would move. Before he ended the call, Harriet's voice softened. Be careful, she said. We don't make accusations until we have the paper clean. Keep the circle small. I know, Matthew said. But he also knew that keeping any circle small was a kindness most patients never received. He was a physician first, but he had become, over years of wards and ethics consults, certain of one thing, that systems rusted when nobody scraped them, and that the most important steps were often the most mundane: a signature, a timestamp, an evidence export. At the door, Damian Blackwell waited with Catherine and 2 lawyers from a family office. He moved like a man who organized people as he organized portfolios. Every gesture economical, every smile a financial instrument. The family's grief, when it surfaced, was curated. Catherine Blackwell kept her hands small and deliberately warm when they reached near the patient's bed, as if to demonstrate the tenderness the family claimed to provide. Dr. Hayes, she said, with the slow confidence of someone used to courtesy, we appreciate your watching over Mother. We want to avoid unnecessary disruption. We're ready to proceed with the paperwork. Matthew met her gaze and saw the practiced softness. He also remembered the line of the recording and the way the son's voice had used words like quicker and quiet. He did not accuse. He did not raise his voice. He had an obligation to the patient and to the rules that govern the hospital. He had to be careful, precise. We have noticed some irregularities in the chart, Matthew said. There are consults listed that were not completed. There are medication administrations logged at times that need review. I will request that Risk and Legal review those entries. It's standard protocol. Catherine's hand flexed once around the bed rail. We hired the best people for her care, she said. You know how delicate she is. We want what's best. That's why I'm taking a closer look, Matthew said. He watched Evelyn in the half-dark. Her fingers twitched at the edge of sleep. He read those micro-movements with the same attention he read an anemic tremor on exam. He caught the memory of Leela's phone and the file she had saved. The son stood a little apart, the family protector. He extended his hand to Matthew, a handshake that conveyed a message: partnership, oversight, a shared interest. Matthew's palm felt the warmth of purpose disguised as charm. He shook it politely. Doctor, I want this resolved quickly, Damian said. We have plans for Mother. Quiet transitions are better for everyone. The phrase, quiet transitions, had a double edge, a euphemism used to cushion moral roughness, a term that could mean comfort or erasure by numbers. Matthew kept his voice neutral. We follow legal and medical advice here. If there is a directive from an appointed guardian, we will honor it, but we need to verify it. In the meantime, patient safety and documentation dictate a review. Catherine's chin lifted just slightly. We have a proxy, notarized. We can present it. Please bring it to Risk, Matthew said. All proxies go through verification. The family left, their stride measured. leaving behind the soft aroma of expensive cologne and the rustle of silk. The room returned to the small sounds of pumps and the quiet hum of air conditioning. Matthew closed the curtain and sat back down, feeling the weight of responsibility in a way that wasn't new but also never lost its gravity. He called Avery Blake, an attorney he trusted, a friend whose work with elder advocacy cases had earned her a reputation for both ferocity and restraint. Avery's voice came through the secure line bright and fast. "Preserve everything," she said before he had finished recounting details. "Export the EMR. Lock the accounts. Get a printed copy of the MAR. Print, sign, and log the chain of custody for that audio. And," she added, slower, "do not let the family remove the patient from the facility without a court order." "Understood," Matthew said. Avery's legal instincts were surgical. "Would you be willing to consult if this escalates?" "I'll be on it. I'll file a temporary restraining order if necessary. But first, keep everything contained. The hospital will need to run their compliance checks. We need a clean paper trail." The mood in the room shifted from the personal to the municipal. The hospital's bureaucracy folded over the moment like a blanket. It could be protective. The same mechanisms that sometimes muffled individual cries could, if properly activated, safeguard someone from predation. Matthew felt the familiar tug of the two roles he often inhabited, clinician and system navigator. He did not want to become anything else. He went to the computer terminal in the staff alcove and began the work that would make the small truth of Leela's file into something consequential. He exported the EMR entries related to Evelyn, saving them into a secure, encrypted sandbox. He stamped each file with a time, his initials, and the hospital's user ID. He printed the MAR and circled the times when PRN sedatives were recorded. He took photographs of the bedside chart and of the thermos with the labeled lid. Each step had to be visible, provable. He placed the audio file into the hospital's evidence lockbox, logged the entry, and signed the chain of custody sheet. He watched Leela sign under his name, her fingers hesitating before the pen met the line, her name pressed with a vigor that registered as both release and risk. "Thank you," he said to her. He meant it. People like Leela stayed in nursing because they couldn't stand the silence when someone was being hurt in their care. She left the room with a small smile that tried to look like professional composure. In the doorway, she turned and met his eyes. "Please," she said, "don't let them make her small." Matthew had no answer beyond the work in front of him. In the department conference room, Harriet set up a meeting with legal counsel and ethics. The chairs smelled faintly of lemon as well, and a whiteboard bore the hospital's mission statement, words that sometimes felt both aspirational and painfully insufficient. Harriet introduced the facts as a neutral clerk would, but with the careful gravity of someone who had seen the ripple effects of these meetings. "We have an audio file," she said. "We have MAR discrepancies. Family is claiming proxy with notarized documentation. We need to verify the proxy's validity, and we must secure the patient from unauthorized transfer." They moved through the checklist. Incident report filed by Dr. Hayes. Audio uploaded and hashed. MAR export and printout. Nursing witness logs. Patient identification cross-checked. Each item was a small lock, and the more locks you turned, the less likely something could slip through. Matthew listened, adding details when asked, feeling the surge of relief that procedural thoroughness sometimes brought. Avery called in to advise. "We will prepare an emergency petition," she said. "We will request an independent guardian be appointed pending hearing. I will also ask for an independent physician to evaluate capacity. If the notarized proxy is not in order, or if the plaintiff's consent appears coerced or absent, the judge can issue an injunction to prevent transfer or alteration of care." "How quickly can you file?" Harriet asked. "As soon as you provide the documentation we've logged," Avery said. "But be mindful, some courts will push back on audio evidence if not authenticated. We need chain of custody, sworn affidavits, and corroborating documentation. Medical records showing irregular PRN administrations alongside the recording will be compelling. Matthew heard the legalese, but more than that, he felt the tightening of possibilities. They were building a case, brick by brick. It could move. It could save. It could also be messy, invasive, and draining. Still, he could see, in a way that was quiet and stubborn, a path forward. Back in the room, shortly after, Matthew sat with Evelyn for a while, close enough to speak softly, far enough to respect sleep. He read 2 pages of Brontë aloud, not because he believed the words would be medicine, but because the ritual of being present mattered. The cadence of language could be a small island for someone who had been largely silenced. She didn't wake. Once, her fingers twitched and a thumb brushed his knuckle. It was a minuscule sign, but it landed like proof. The person inside was present, despite the talk of trustees and transitions. He kept watch over the afternoon as the legal and institutional mechanism wound into motion. A social worker appeared and took a careful conversational inventory: relationships, finances, advance directives. She left with a stack of photocopies and a request for more documents. Later, a parish volunteer knocked and offered to bring in a favorite blanket. Matthew declined, explaining the need to restrict non-essential visitors while the review was ongoing. When the family returned, Catherine carried a slender folder with the crisp paper of notarized documents. She placed it gently on the bedside table and looked at Matthew as if he were the final arbiter of a moral calculus. "This is Mother's directive," Catherine said, "signed and notarized. We're simply asking you to follow her wishes." Matthew opened the folder and scanned the document. It was neat, legalese wrapped in ink, an appointed power of attorney with signatures and the stamp of a notary. On paper, it looked solid, but paper could be a stage prop as much as a shield. He had learned not to trust the comfort of neatness alone. "We will verify the notarization," he said. "That is normal procedure. Until then, the patient remains under our care." Catherine's jaw tightened. Damien shifted behind her. He leaned in, close enough that Matthew felt the smell of expensive aftershave and the faint metallic tang of someone who traveled for business. "You understand, delay is not in her best interest," Damien said, in a voice that tried to be paternal and efficient at once. "The will is clear. We just want to avoid escalation." "Escalation is sometimes necessary to protect the patient," Matthew said evenly. "We have a potential conflict of interest in the family's request. That requires a higher level of verification. It's not escalation for its own sake." Damien's face hardened, and for a second his composure snapped into something more human, a flash of impatience that, despite the family's curated gentleness, looked like contempt for obstacles. He tightened his mouth into a smile and said, "We trust you, Doctor." The phrase was a little too practiced. Matthew returned the smile with a small private thing, a quietness that belonged less to victory than to moral refusal. He had been warned by the nurse, the family had warned him. The worst, they might call her, was trouble. He let the phrase sit in the air, and then, when there was a moment alone in the doorway with Damon, he allowed himself a tiny action. He softened his expression, the way you soften a face when speaking to a person you will not accuse, but whom you will not let misplace a life. "Not to me," he said, just under his breath. He did not make it a pronouncement. It was a small, humane piece of defiance, less than confrontation, more than acquiescence. The words rode along the corridor and did not disturb the family. They landed with Leela when she passed him in the hall, and she gave him a look that held gratitude like a coin. By evening, the hospital had done what it could to lock the case in place. Legal counsel instructed that movement of the patient would require an order. The risk office placed a soft hold on transfers. The hospital's security team noted the need to prevent unauthorized removal without initiating an adversarial tone. The administrative motions had begun. They were the kind of thing that did not make for newspaper fodder, but which did the heavy lifting in these situations. Yet procedural victories did not feel like absolution. Matthew sat at his desk after rounds and reviewed the chart again. The MAR had been annotated. The scrub nurse had added a separate note about a dosing decision that had been made at 03:10 in the morning. Sedative given, per family request noted in shorthand, but with no recorded prescriber. That lacuna was the kind of inconsistency that could sink a strategy if left unaddressed. He printed the relevant pages, aligned them on his desk, and placed a thin, raw legal pad beside them. He wrote down clear steps: secure audio, get sworn affidavits from nursing staff, photograph and log the proxy documents, request handwriting analysis if the signature's authenticity seemed dubious. He asked himself the questions that always kept him awake when cases weighed on his conscience. Had the patient expressed any prior directives? Who would speak for her when she couldn't? Did the family have the authority they claimed, or the motive they claimed? He walked the questions like a yardstick across the facts. The answer to the last was partial. The family's assets were substantial. They had legal counsel. That did not make them bad actors. It only made it necessary to be thorough. Before leaving the hospital that night, he stood once more in the doorway of room 412. Evelyn's breathing was steady under the monitor's soft beep. He placed a hand on the thermos and felt an old warmth that perhaps had once belonged to another person's kitchen, a familiarity not erased by antiseptic. The small things mattered now more than ever. They were the last defensible line between a person and the abstraction that sometimes swallowed them in life. Leela stopped at the threshold and caught him looking. "Doctor," she said, "will she be okay?" He let himself answer both honestly and with the steadiness the room needed. "We will do everything we can. We'll follow the rules, and we'll listen to the small signs. We'll keep a chain of custody for your file. That keeps you safe, it keeps her safe." She exhaled a long breath and nodded. She folded her hands in front of her as if she had turned the tremor into a shape she could hold. "She's got freckles," she said suddenly, as if to anchor the patient to the human in the face of legal forms. "You can see them in the light when she snooks a little, like a constellation." Matthew smiled. It was small and private, the sort of smile that didn't claim victory, but claimed recognition. "Not to me," he said again, "not as a slogan, but as a promise, an oath in human terms rather than one signed on parchment." His phone buzzed. Avery's name flashed on the screen. He let it go to voicemail and instead recorded a succinct clinical note. Incident report filed, audio uploaded and hashed, chain of custody printed, family proxy received for verification, transfer hold placed. Then he added a personal note to himself. "Read the Brontë aloud again tomorrow. Sometimes rituals are the only things that anchor a person when bureaucracies do their work." As he locked his office and stepped into the night's elevator, the hospital hummed in the familiar way, lights in some rooms glowing, monitors ticking, the midnight rituals of cleaning and stock. He had set in motion a series of things he hoped would protect Evelyn. The legal gears would turn, the court might become a neutral place where facts were weighed in the way he had tried to weight them in the quiet hours of his shift. He did not believe that paperwork would substitute for care, but he believed that without careful documentation, care could be silenced. Outside, the city's winter air cut and smelled faintly of rain. The hospital's glass facade reflected his image in a way that made him look smaller than he felt. A man carrying other people's choices and vows on a shift-by-shift basis. He walked to his car thinking about the strange, ordinary things that made a life. Chamomile tea, a dog-eared book, freckles like tiny maps of seasons. He thought of Evelyn's thumb brushing his knuckle, and of Leela's small, brave gesture of preservation. In the days that followed, the machine of the hospital and the machine of the law began to articulate themselves against one another, like two slow engines aligning dents. The family produced the notarized proxy again, crisp and stamped and ceremonious. The hospital quietly ordered handwriting analysis on the signature. Legal counsel quietly advised the family to maintain calm and compliance while the review proceeded. The pattern was familiar. Everyone in their roles, each playing the music society expected them to play. But underneath the bureaucratic rhythm was a human pulse that could not be signed away. The pulse of Evelyn's presence, the worn pages of Brontë, the scent of chamomile, the small constellation of freckles on a face that suggested a life of sun and book and weather. Matthew kept returning to those small facts. He made notes in the margins of his days. Check MAR for irregular PRN. Confirm nurse witness affidavits. Ensure secure uploaded copy of audio intact. Do not allow family removal without court order. He called in a neurologist for a formal consult, standard care given Evelyn's presentation, and requested a capacity assessment by the hospital's independent physician. It was a neutral step, one that protected the patient and shielded the staff from improvised judgments. The neurologist's examination was gentle, questions asked in simple terms, a test of attention and recall performed like a soft instrument. Evelyn's eyes opened at times, tracked a voice, squeezed a hand when asked. The results were not a definitive judgment, but a portrait of someone whose autonomy had been compromised, not entirely gone, but fragile and contested. At the end of that second day, Matthew sat at his desk and looked over the chain of custody logs, Leela's initials, his initials, Harriet's, the legal clerk's. Each signature felt like a bead on a rosary of proof. He had done the small, unspectacular things that could make the difference between a life being respected or being drained through administrative convenience. Yet he also knew this truth: paper and protocol were not salvation. They were scaffolding. The human work, holding a hand, reading a passage aloud, recognizing freckles, was the thing that would keep a person tethered to dignity. He thought then of the phrase the family had used in a public way, quiet transitions, and the way it had been rehearsed into a kind of euphemism. He thought of how easy it was for language to smooth over intentions. He did not intend to make the family devils. He intended to keep the patient whole while the mechanisms that protected her did their work. When he finally turned off his light at home, the city thin and quiet outside his window, Matthew found that he could still taste the night on his tongue. The hospital lemon scent, the chamomile tea, the coldness of legal documentation. He opened the small dog-eared Brontë a few pages and read to himself by lamplight. The cadence of lines steadied something in him. He repeated the phrase in his head one last time before sleep. Not to me. In the early hours, an email pinged. Avery had sent a preliminary note. She would file a temporary emergency petition if the hospital council agreed. She wanted notarized copies and the MAR prints attached to her filing. The language was efficient and precise. It felt like the next gear had engaged. Matthew lay in bed with the sound of the city muffled outside and the memory of a finger pressed briefly into his knuckle. He thought of the small rituals that tethered people: tea, the smell of books, the shape of a hand. He thought of Leela's courage and the thin way a recording could shift the balance of authority. He did not believe in grand gestures. He believed in documentation, in care, and in the stubborn dignity of small acts. Morning would bring more coffee and more forms. It would bring Catherine's polished voice again, and perhaps another statement from Damien about efficiency and family business. It would bring the judge's schedule and the possibility of a hearing. There would be more steps, legal filings, handwriting analyses, sworn statements, each built on the last. And somewhere beneath the paperwork, there was a woman in room 412. whose freckles and Brontë and thermos made her a person rather than a case. For Matthew, that would be the test. Whether the hospital would read more than ink. Whether the systems meant to protect would follow through. Whether small acts of courage by people like Leela would be honored or erased. He stood up, put on his coat, and checked his pockets for his keys and his pen. In the doorway, he paused and brushed his thumb across the spine of the Brontë on the bedside table. It made no practical difference. It was ceremonial, a small covenant between him and the person who lay there, an agreement to notice. Then he went downstairs to the risk office, to the printer, to the legal counsel, to the slow litany of actions that, in their sum, could mean the difference between someone being reduced to a set of signatures and being allowed to breathe as a whole person. He pressed the elevator button and waited, feeling the soft, stubborn pulse of a promise he had already made. Morning arrived with the sort of small, steady light that made the hospital's linoleum seem almost kind. Matthew walked back into room 412 with a cup of coffee and the day's first printouts tucked under his arm. The chain of custody log lay like a legal talisman on the bedside table. Names, timestamps, initials. In the cold, fluorescent clarity of morning, it read, simply, as proof that someone had taken the trouble to mark the moments when choices were made. Harriet and a legal clerk met him in the conference room before rounds. Avery had already filed the emergency petition, and both the hospital's counsel and the clerk had copies. The word temporary restraining order sat on their lips like a careful instrument. The hospital hoped for it, but everyone knew that courts moved on their own measure. We asked for a temporary injunction to prevent any transfer or major alteration of care, Avery said, folding her hands in the way she did when she had to make a point without raising her voice. We've requested appointment of an independent guardian pending a hearing, and we've asked for an independent medical evaluation to determine capacity. Good, Harriet said. We've also placed an administrative hold on anyone listed as prescriber if their entries aren't corroborated. Avery's also requested a forensic analyst for the audio, Matthew added. Chain of custody's intact, but the court will want authentication. We have Leela's affidavit confirming she saved the file immediately. Avery nodded. And we'll request handwriting analysis on the proxy signature. If the signature isn't consistent with known exemplars, that bolsters our case. They moved as a small, efficient machine. The evidence repository hummed in the background as technicians printed hashed files, wrapped physical media in tamper-evident seals, and documented every movement. The hospital's secure server produced logs that shimmered with digital timestamps, who accessed which file, when, and from where. In law, the detail is not an indulgence. It is the mechanism by which one person's truth can be legible to another. Matthew felt the odd, dry relief of watching details make themselves into arguments. He knew the courtroom would not be for spectacle, but for method. The gentle certainty of a good watch, cogs meeting teeth, comforted him more than rhetoric would. The family retained counsel from a firm with a soft municipal veneer. When Catherine arrived, she carried the same folder as before. Her composure had an edge now, as if the curated softness had hardened into resolve. Damien's calmness was cooler than before. Their lawyer's tone was obliging and precise. We have the proxy, their counsel said. It's notarized. We contest that any temporary injunction is necessary. The family has the right to make decisions in a time-sensitive circumstance. Avery countered with facts, odd MAR entries, the audio, the lack of signed prescriber orders. We're seeking only to ensure the patient's will is respected and her personhood is protected while the court assesses the proxy's validity, she said. The hearing took place on a muted afternoon in a courthouse where the wood smelled faintly of polish and the windows let in light that softened the city's edges. The judge was not theatrical. She was precise, asking Avery to state facts, asking counsel for the family to produce documentation. She questioned the process by which the hospital had verified the proxy, and then asked for the chain of custody records. Avery presented the audio as an exhibit. She explained, step by step, the safeguards. The file had been uploaded to the hospital's secure repository. The hash value matched the copy printed for the court. Leela would testify that she had preserved the file and not altered it. The audio analyst's report would follow if the court accepted preliminary admission. The judge listened with the dispassionate steadiness of someone accustomed to thinly veiled moral crises. When Avery asked for authentication, the hospital's audio expert, an engineer with the dry humor of technicians, spoke precisely, showing the court spectrographic analyses and waveforms that indicated the recording had no signs of splicing or tampering within the resolution limits available. He explained how the metadata and hospital repository logs served as a corroborating trunk. Timestamps, user IDs, the sealed evidence bag in which the phone had been placed. The judge asked measured questions about legal admissibility. Avery answered with the same careful certainty she showed when breaking down a complex statute. Handwriting analysis arrived as another instrument of ordinariness. The handwriting expert compared the proxy's signature to known samples supplied by independent sources. Election forms, a bank signature card, a greeting card. He testified to inconsistencies in stroke pressure, letter formation, and certain idiosyncratic loops absent from the proxy. He did not make moral pronouncements. He said instead what analysts say. This set of strokes differed from the exemplars in ways statistically significant enough to require closer scrutiny. Under cross-examination, the family's counsel tried to point to procedural gaps and to argue that the audio, while concerning, did not on its own prove coercion. Avery acknowledged the limits. The law did not live on a single file, but she had assembled corroboration. PRN administrations at times when the son's voice said, "Don't wake her for the meds," nursing notes that raised questions, and the absence of proper prescriber authorization. The judge, pragmatic, noted that patient safety and the risk of irreversible outcomes required precaution. Her ruling was procedural and careful. She issued an injunction preventing transfer or major change of care, appointed an independent guardian pending a full hearing, and ordered an independent physician to conduct a thorough capacity evaluation. She took pains to clarify that the ruling was provisional, not a finding of final culpability, but it set a clear barrier. No moving the patient, no unilateral changes from the family, and the appointment of Dr. Sophia Mendez as the court's independent neurologist and assessor. Back at the hospital, Dr. Langston, a senior physician whose name had appeared in the consult list and whose chart notes now bore extra scrutiny, was placed on administrative leave while an inquiry examined whether he had formally signed or engaged with the patient's care. It was a procedural pause, not a verdict. The hospital needed to separate personnel issues from clinical care to protect both patients and staff. The press had not yet circled. The work remained, for the most part, a set of papers and secure servers humming in locks. Dr. Sophia Mendez arrived with a quiet manner and a methodical mind. She examined Evelyn with the gentle rituals of a clinician who understood the difference between testing and indignity. She asked Evelyn simple questions, offered hand grips, assessed comprehension by asking about daily routines and familiars. The tests were ordinary. Name 3 objects, follow a short command, repeat a sentence. Each successful simple gesture registered as a small, granular victory. Evelyn's eyes opened more often during Dr. Mendez's visits. The neurologist documented a mixed picture. The patient displayed intermittent clarity, some language retrieval challenges, and a degree of fluctuating capacity influenced by sedative exposure and fatigue. The assessment counseled caution. Evelyn's autonomy was impaired but not obliterated. The court's independent guardian, an elder law professional appointed to avoid conflict, arranged for conservatorship with limited powers to ensure decisions matched documented preferences when those preferences could be established. It was not meant as permanence. It was, Avery emphasized, a legislative scaffold to preserve the possibility of later restoration. Weeks passed, and the small victories began to gather like persistent, cautious weather. Speech therapy sessions started with repetition. Cup, book, chamomile. Occupational therapy coaxed her hands into tasks that had once been automatic. Buttoning a loose cuff, lifting a mug with a secure grip. A therapist carried a small box of tactile objects and watched Evelyn's face light when she found the texture of a familiar knitted cloth. Progress was measured in millimeters. A longer gaze, a clear syllable, a coordinated swallow without coughing. Each was a proof that the person under the paperwork remained present. The Brontë book stayed on the bedside table, the spine soft as before. Matthew kept returning to the ritual of reading, but less from the prescriptive notion that literature heals, and more as a human anchor. One afternoon, reading aloud, he reached a line that caught on Evelyn's tongue. She repeated it, slow and slurred, and then smiled in the way of someone who had reclaimed a phrase from their own memory. "You read that line again," she murmured later, voice hoarse but emphatic. "It used to make me think of storms." "It still does," Matthew said, aware he was breaching a boundary, the way one might step off a curb, a small, tentative thing. He kept his tone professional. He declined invitations to sit too long or to make promises he couldn't keep. For the first months, he was present as clinician and system steward, not as a private confidant. Evelyn's voice, when it came, was not a return to the past, but a reclamation. She asked questions about the proxy and about the audio. She frowned when Matthew explained the legal steps, and later, with more clarity, she took Leela's hand and described an earlier conversation that had been brushed aside as confusion but now registered in the pattern. When they spoke about trustees, they spoke like they were choosing for a book, not for a person, she said. Her words landed like stones dropped into a pond, small ripples widening. Catherine, in private meetings with the guardian and with her counsel, argued that the family had acted in what they believed to be her mother's best interest. There was travail in her explanations, references to delicate finances, to a fear of protracted suffering, to the costs and indignities of long care. Matthew did not see a cartoon villain. He watched a woman who had convinced herself of a narrative that made hard choices seem like kindness. Damon's posture loosened over time, or perhaps the pressure simply wore him down. He stopped making casual remarks in the corridors. When asked the question about PRN dosing, he could not easily answer in detail. He deferred to counsel, and his statements became measured. There were hints later that financial strain had pressed against decision-making, that consultants and trustees had whispered about expediency. None of that turned into a neat moral equation. Instead, it looked like the messy overlap between fear, money, and agency, dynamics that the law and the hospital's policies were designed to mediate. Avery's filings grew more robust. She filed a motion attaching the handwriting analyst's report, the audio authentication, sworn affidavits from nursing staff, and logs showing the lack of prescribing signatures for certain sedative administrations. She requested that, should the court find probable cause that coercion had occurred, the matter be referred to prosecutors for criminal review. The judge did not make a criminal finding. She did make a finding that the hospital should continue to protect the patient while the guardianship and formal proof unfolded. The family's counsel, seeing the momentum, took a quieter posture. They produced additional documentation, bank statements, funeral wishes, letters that suggested some prior planning. But none of the materials bluntly contradicted the core problem. The presence of a recording in which the son discussed keeping his mother quiet, and the concurrent pattern of PRN sedatives logged at times that matched family presence. The court's role was not to render moral proclamations, but to make sure the patient could not be moved or further medicated without verified authority. Months became a sequence of small, tempered steps. The hospital instituted daily interdisciplinary huddles for Evelyn's care. Nursing, speech therapy, occupational therapy, social work, legal counsel, and the guardian. They updated the MAR protocol, making clear that family requests for medication had to be electronically authenticated by a prescriber present in the chart. Harriet led a working group on proxy verification. That, under pressure from her own conscience and from outside observers, drafted a policy. Notarized proxies would be accepted only after independent confirmation and a brief waiting period when there was any sign of conflict. In a public statement, the hospital's board framed the policy changes as an institutional tightening of existing safeguards. Internally, nurses felt vindicated. Leela, who had risked her job by saving a file rather than erasing it, received a letter of commendation and a small award for moral courage. She accepted it with a look that held the tenderness of someone who had been heard. Evelyn improved in a non-linear way. One morning she sat up and took a sip from her thermos without guidance. Months later she signed a statement, with the guardian present and with legal counsel, to indicate her desire to have her own documents reviewed and, where possible, her autonomy restored. The handwriting analysis on the proxy remained a key part of the record. The court, seeing the weight of documented discrepancies and the patient's own emerging expressiveness, allowed for a re-evaluation of limited powers the guardian held. Then, in a hearing that was quieter than the emergency one, the judge considered Dr. Mendis's follow-up assessment. The independent physician testified that Evelyn's cognitive function had improved with cessation of unnecessary sedation and with consistent therapy. She argued the patient was not yet wholly autonomous, but had regained enough decisional capacity in some domains to engage in limited surrogate decisions. The judge ordered a phased restoration of select powers to Evelyn, contingent on continued outpatient follow-up and documentation. It was not a miraculous restoration, it was a carefully scaffolded one. Evelyn's agreement to the restoration of some decision-making came with provisos. She wanted an independent financial advisor recommended by the guardian, she wanted clear documentation on any future medication changes, and she wanted a trusted person from the hospital, someone like Leela or a social worker, present for major meetings. She made each request with a directness that felt like a woman claiming an inheritance, not of money, but of dignity. The family accepted the court's decision with a kind of hollow civility. There were private letters, apologies framed as miscommunications. Avery encouraged Evelyn to consider an advocacy role, and an idea took root in her: a foundation to help others vulnerable to undue influence. It was as if the confluence of harm had been shaped into a new purpose. Months later, with therapy continuing and capacity regained in clear, documented ways, Evelyn stood at a table in a small community center to sign the paperwork that launched the Blackwell Foundation for the Protection of Elder Autonomy. Harriet and Avery were there. Leela had arranged the folded chamomile tea sachets in the gift baskets. The Foundation's mission, education on proxy verification, training for hospital staff, legal support for contested guardianship cases, was practical and rooted in the small, granular interventions that had mattered to Evelyn. At the ribbon cutting, photographers crowded the modest room. There were teary faces and statements about systemic change. Evelyn, who had always had a measured manner, gripped the scissors with hands steadied by months of occupational therapy. She smiled in a way that was not theatrical, but luminous with gratitude. She noted later that the Brontë book had been the first thing she asked for every morning. It had been, she said to the gathered crowd, a small piece of truth I could hold. Matthew attended as a physician, a friend, and a near stranger to the public narrative. He had not been Evelyn's treating attending for months. Professional ethics made that boundary necessary and healthy. When he saw her at the line of chairs after the ceremony, he felt the old, soft tug of something neither simple nor urgent. They spoke as equals now, two adults who had shared a difficult season. "You kept coming back to the tea," Evelyn said, folding the corner of a speech she had written into a pocket. "I didn't know there would be such a thing as a chamomile hero." He smiled in that way he always had, quiet, careful, not a claim but an acknowledgement. "Not to me," he said, and there was the echo of the phrase again, less a slogan than a memory of a moment when someone refused an easy categorization of a life. Evelyn laughed, a small, full sound. For months she had been reclaiming her words. Now she had one for him. "I meant it for me," she said, more seriously. "When I wrote something like that, I meant I didn't want machines to define my end. I meant that I wanted to live the life I could live, with my hands and my book and my chamomile. They turned it into an instrument, and that's what made it." She stopped, searching for language. "The system can warp language," Matthew said. "My job is to keep asking what the words mean in a human voice." They walked out into the crisp day and sat on a bench near the community center, a safe distance from the cameras and the board members practicing their institutional speeches. It was the first time they had been together without hospital ID badges or court orders hovering between them. "I don't want you to be my doctor," Evelyn said suddenly, clear, direct. "I don't want you to be the man who saved my papers. I want you to be a person who liked the same line in Brontë as I did." "I hear that," Matthew said. He felt the precise, necessary friction of professional ethics set around his heart like a careful band. He had waited for this, not because of a vow of disinterest, but because real intimacy required that any relationship be free of shadowed obligations. He had been careful in the months of her recovery. He will be careful now. "If you want that, we'll approach it slowly. We'll do it responsibly. We won't confuse gratitude for obligation." She tilted her head, the small constellation of freckles catching the sun. "Slow is a word I like," she said. "I have a calendar of small victories. You can come to one." He agreed to the calendar and to the tempo it implied. They began by meeting for coffee in neutral spaces, cafes that smelled of beans and pastry rather than antiseptic, and then for short walks that had nothing to do with care plans. They read aloud together sometimes, each taking turns with a paragraph from Brontë, and sometimes they let the silence sit between them like an agreeable presence. Their relationship grew in the daylight of consent and choice. Neither rushed it. He made sure his work remained separate from their private life. He stopped attending her medical team huddles, citing his recusal, and he supported her as a friend and later, when they both agreed it was right, as a partner. Others in the hospital respected the boundaries he'd set. Harriet and Avery watched the unfolding with approval tempered by professional curiosity. Meanwhile, the hospital's reforms rippled outward. The new Croxy verification policy reduced ambiguous transfers, and a training module on undue influence became mandatory for all staff. The Risk Office instituted a protocol for preserving digital media with explicit chain of custody steps and a whistleblower hotline that allowed anonymous reporting of concerns. The board published a white paper on elder protection that drew on Evelyn's case as an example, not of spectacle, but of systemic lessons. In quiet moments, Matthew thought about the ways institutions could both shield and fail. He thought about Leela's trembling hands when she saved the audio, and he visited the nursing station with small gifts and genuine thanks. He recognized that the heavy lifting of moral courage often fell to people whose jobs already asked everything of them: nurses, social workers, therapists. He also realized change required those people to be supported by policy, law, and the relentless, slow insistence of documentation. The legal referral to prosecutors, filed as a possibility in the early petition, remained an open question. Avery had referred the matter for review. Prosecutors acknowledged the receipt and began preliminary inquiries. The public record would show an investigation. The narrative that follows a single case is never neat. The hospital's reforms, however, were immediate and concrete. Evelyn's foundation began, cautiously, to sponsor workshops about proxy verification and elder autonomy. The first grant they issued went to a community health clinic that offered free notarization checks and legal clinics for seniors. The press liked the human image and the institutional promises. The real work was less photogenic: staff training, revised consent forms, and a quiet lobbying effort that sought to make notarization processes more rigorous. One winter afternoon, several months after the ribbon cutting, Matthew visited Evelyn at her modest apartment, an upstairs room filled with light and the smell of tea. The Brontë book lay open on her coffee table. On the shelf were small things: the thermos she had brought from the hospital, neatly washed and labeled, a framed photograph of her younger self with friends, a small plaque from the hospital thanking staff and supporters. They made chamomile in the old thermos and drank from mismatched cups as if in some private ritual. She read aloud a paragraph, and this time he interrupted her with a question about a line. They argued, lightly, about whether the character's kindness was a true virtue or a complacency, and the debate was the sort of domestic intimacy that had nothing to do with the past crisis. It was, in small ways, the normality they had both earned. Evelyn's foundation had a modest website and a small advisory board that included Harriet and Avery. Leela volunteered to help run outreach programs. The foundation's first case involved a neighbor who had been persuaded by a distant relative to sign over access to bank accounts. A clinic referral and a lawyer funded by the foundation helped to sort out the matter. These were not headlines. They were the slow, essential work of preventing small violences. At a dinner months later, simple, in a small restaurant that smelled of garlic, Evelyn and Matthew talked about what had changed in them. He spoke of how the case had sharpened his sense of the hospital's role as both sanctuary and bureaucracy. She spoke of how fragile agency had felt and how indignity often arrived wrapped in concern. They both acknowledged the odd moral luck that had landed on room 412, that a nurse had had the courage to keep a file, that a doctor had the bureaucratic patience to upload and log, that an attorney had the will to push for hearings. "You were warned," Evelyn said abruptly, stirring her tea. "You were told I would be trouble." Matthew looked at her, at the fine lines near her eyes that had always been there and now bore a story. They said it as if a person could be boxed. "You weren't trouble. You were—" He struggled for the right word and found it in the end. "You were a person with preferences, some of which had been overridden." She tilted her head and laughed softly. "And you smiled and said—" "Not to me," he supplied, the phrase a soft inheritance between them. "Keep saying it," she said, "in public. It's a good line." He kept saying it, but it no longer functioned purely as a private oath. Sometimes he said it when he introduced the training module, and sometimes he said it when he thanked a nurse by name. It had become, for him, a small ethic: look, document, and refuse to let language be used as a weapon against personhood. Years later, the Blackwell Foundation's office would mount a simping plaque in the lobby of the hospital, "In honor of those who notice small things." Leela's name would be in a list of contributors. Harriet would deliver ongoing trainings. The hospital's proxy verification policy would be cited in conferences and gradually influence regional practices. Evelyn would travel, slowly, to speak at forums about the importance of legal literacy for the elderly. She would always, when asked, tell the story with particular tenderness about the chamomile thermos and the dog-eared Brontë, and about how small, brave actions, saving a file, documenting a MAR discrepancy, refusing to allow paperwork to obscure a person, made the difference. In the end, the moment that defined Matthew for many who knew the story was not the courtroom or the policy memo. It was a quiet flash, a small moral gesture witnessed by those who cared. A smile in a corridor, a soft refusal to consign a human being to caricature. They warned the doctor she was trouble, people would say, and then tell the quieter part, the human hinge. But he smiled softly and said, "Not to me." Evelyn and Matthew's relationship, grown in the soil of boundaries and consent, remained slow and careful. They married 1 year after the Foundation's founding in a small ceremony under a tree that caught the afternoon light in the way hospital fluorescents never could. Leela walked down the aisle with a small bouquet of chamomile flowers. Harriet spoke at the reception about systems and humanity. Avery toasted the couple with the dry wit of someone who had watched the legal scaffolding hold a life in place until the person could step back into their own story. They did not present themselves as heroes. They presented themselves as people who had done the work, messy and administrative and slow, to protect a life. The Foundation continued. The hospital's policy persisted. The prosecutor's inquiry, referenced in early filings, proceeded along its own course. Some elements were referred for further review, and the public record remained complex and open to legal processes that outlasted any single telling. Years later, when Evelyn's hair had gone thinner and her freckles had woken under summer sun, she would sit with Matthew on a front porch reading aloud. Children from Foundation programs would visit and borrow her Brontë, and she would talk to them about the small, brave things to look for. A signature that didn't quite feel like a hand, a family member who spoke too much about efficiency, the patient whose voice was small and needed amplification. Matthew would sometimes lean in and say the line, quiet, not triumphant, "Not to me." It was not a slogan, but a practice. They had both learned that dignity demanded both paperwork and presence, that protecting a life required both signatures and steady attention. In the end, the phrase closed not as a final victory, but as a reminder. Look more closely than ink. Preserve the chain of custody for things that matter. Never let bureaucratic language eclipse the human voice. Room 412's thermos lived on in a small glass-fronted case in the Foundation's office, a humble relic of a season when small objects held the weight of decisions. Under it, a plaque read, "Not to me, an ethic of seeing." People who visited would read the line and feel, for a moment, the quiet insistence that a life is more than paperwork. And somewhere, in the small private moments between Evelyn and Matthew, that insistence turned into ordinary acts. Chamomile poured in the morning, a passage from Brontë read aloud, a hand offered and taken. They had been warned. He had smiled softly and refused their framing. The rest, they would say, was the long, unglamorous work of making sure the world could not so easily mistake documents for destiny.